All right, hi, my name is Kyle Ingram. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to talk today about federal RIFs, particularly the bump and retreat functions within the federal reduction in force regulations. They're a little bit complicated, and there's a piece of this that you really need to understand to be able to understand anything about bumping and retreating, because it sounds like you can go anywhere, but you can't. And I'm going to get into a little bit about what the issues are that have come up with respect to the competitive areas, particularly with the HHS RIFs and the whole agency reductions in force that have come with, for example, USAID and CFPB, and there are other offices, other agencies that are being completely shut down, usually smaller agencies. But this would be important to understand if you're looking to try to bump or retreat. And it might also explain why, even if you have a veteran's preference, that veteran's preference might not mean a whole bunch in this context. This is legal information. I can't provide any legal advice in this context, and nothing in this presentation is going to create an attorney-client relationship between you and me. To the extent that it is such, it's attorney advertising. Anything that I say here, take with a grain of salt. You should consult with a qualified attorney to find out what the specifics are for your situation that are relevant. Okay, so let me talk about the reduction in force process. The major issue here is the competitive area. That has come out in this context, in the context of these DOJ RIFs, as being the biggest piece of this, because the competitive area defines everything else that comes within it, including your bumping, retreating, and other competition rights. So the competitive area is at least your local commuting area, and there is a unit within your agency that is being reorganized. And so that has become the major issue for all of these reductions in force, especially with HHS, and I suspect with some further agencies that are coming along, is that the unit that is being reorganized is not just any unit. There is a specific level at which it has to minimally take place. A division, a bureau, these are what the courts have said, but realistically, it has to do with something much more specific, which is control over personnel management. And how that exactly shakes out is going to be different for each agency. It's probably going to depend a lot on delegations of authority, and frankly, we just don't have a lot of case law that tells us what it is under the current regulations, because those regulations were redefined in the 1990s, and a lot of the issues with this go back to the 1980s. So those cases aren't necessarily applicable to now. There are some cases that have interpreted this. It's not a precise science, I wouldn't say. So within your competitive area, I'm going to bring up my map here in a minute, and you'll see how these all work together. There's a tenure group. These are usually used with 1, 2, or 3 in Roman numerals. So it looks like an L, 2 L's, and 3 L's, but it should be Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. So the permanent groups, that's going to be the vast majority of you out there watching this. The probationary is not technically correct. It's generally the probationary employees, but it's really a small category of probationary and career conditional employees. So if you're looking at this and you're a permanent employee, but you know that there's somebody who's in a career conditional, who is career conditional at this point, that is a person that might be capable of being bumped. And then there's temporary employees. Most of groups 2 and 3 are no longer in federal employment anymore, despite some of the court actions that have happened. So I'm not going to talk about that, but just know that we're going to get to bumping, and you're going to see why that becomes a problem if you're a permanent employee. Then there are subgroups within your tenure group, okay? Disabled veterans, those who have 30% or more, as determined by the VA. So those are group AD. And then you've got veterans who are A, and then all others are considered B. So you might see group 2B is your probationary employees who are non-veterans. Permanent group 1, AD, that's going to be your permanent employees who are disabled veterans. So within these groups, subgroups, and within the competitive area, they establish what's called a competitive level. I'm sorry, my dumb mug is in front of the competitive levels there. But the competitive levels are constructed using all of the people who have interchangeable jobs within an area. So it depends on the specific kind of job. Not all jobs are going to be interchangeable with each other. The rule is generally that if you can be retrained to do somebody else's job in 90 days and vice versa, then you are in the same competitive level. But it's not going to include like supervisors and non-supervisors. Yeah, and so it says here, no undue interruption. That's how they define undue interruption, is the 90 days retraining. So if you have questions about, that's definitely something that you'd want to double click on if you can get into a competitive level that is going to remain at the agency. Here's my map. This is the competitive area. So everything is going to be taking place within your competitive area, which makes it really important to understand that the competitive area is going to be the thing that gets litigated here in almost all of these cases where some part of the agency is going to continue and the other part isn't. The competitive area defines all of those people that you can compete with, either on a competitive level or through bumping or retreating. So if they define a competitive area as being an entire office or a division and they get rid of that office or division, there's nobody there for you to compete with. You have no competition rights. So the only option that you have at that point is to go after and litigate your competitive area. So you can see here on the top, it says organizational unit. Let me see if I can get no, I can't get my screen to do that. Okay, whatever. So at the top, it says organizational unit. That's the part that you're going to want to have evaluated and to litigate that. The geographic commuting area, that's pretty simple. It's not pretty simple, but in most cases, it's pretty easy to understand where the geographic or commuting area is. So this is where I have bad news for people who work in, for example, a regional office where the entire regional office is just disappearing. That geographic area is the minimum. That's all they have to give you. So if they do an entire office within a geographic area, they can do that. And so you don't have any bumping or retreating rights. You cannot go outside of that geographic area to try to bump somebody else. Now, if the agency voluntarily makes it a larger group than just the geographic commuting area, they can do that. Right now, you've got a possibility of a little bit more competition. I wouldn't bet on it. That is not the purpose of these reductions in force. They're not trying to give people any kind of rights. The purpose of these reductions in force, from my interpretation, is to give people as few rights as possible and to give them as few opportunities for litigation as possible. And so the way they're doing that is by restricting the size of the competitive area to specific offices or to specific regions, and then just getting rid of everybody in that entire region. They're not doing like a 50% cut. They are not doing any kind of taking from the bottom or whoever's last in the door type of thing. They are getting rid of everybody in a specific office. So 5 CFR 351, that's going to cover all of these regulations. If you have questions about those regulations, you should go and take a look there. That's where to start. Previously, I think I had 531. That was incorrect. So it's 351. Tenure groups. So this is what I was talking about before. All of these tenure groups should be the same size here on this graph. They're not, just because it takes up too much space to have all three of them, because I'm going to put some more stuff on here. But there's 3 tenure groups. They're all, notice, within the competitive area here. So as you go from the right-hand side to the left-hand side, so as you're reading across, there's the more protected to the less protected, okay? From left to right, it's more protected to less protected. So anybody who's in the permanent tenure group, they're going to have more retention standing than probationary employees and temporary employees. Again, probationary is just a catch-all term here. It includes more than that. But it's that those people will probably the vast majority of the people who are in tenure group 2. So within the tenure groups, you've got the subgroups. So each of these subgroups, so the subgroups, disabled veterans, and subgroups, you've got subgroup AD, subgroup A, and subgroup B. Okay. So this is the map of how they all work together so that you can see where you fall in this. So are you a veteran? It depends on where you are on this map, depends on if you're in tenure group 2 or 3, because these 1, 2, AD, A, and B would be reproduced in tenure group 2 and tenure group 3 for somewhat obvious reasons. Now, I'm not going to make that appear here, but just understand that if For example, if there were a veteran who were in group 2, let's say he's a career conditional, which is part of group 2, that person would be over, they would not be in the veteran subgroup, they would be a probationary subgroup, or probationary tenure group 2, subgroup A. Okay, but I'm going to use this map because it's simplified. It makes it a lot easier to understand. All right, so now if you're looking at this, we're going to go through the process of having a bumping and retreating, and you'll see how this works. Okay, and you'll see why competitive area is so important, especially for anybody whose higher office is being shut down. Okay, not just a commuting office being shut down. It's important for a sub office within a division. That's important, it's important for that as well. Okay, so the order of release you can see at the bottom is going from first to last, and this is the competitive level. So the competitive level actually goes over these different groups, and that's how they arrange it, is in this order. I think it's pretty easy to understand, but most of the cases that I'm seeing right now, competitive level has nothing to do with how people are being released, because the whole competitive area is going. So if your whole competitive area is going, everybody along this line, no matter the years of service and performance, no matter if they're disabled veterans or other, they're all getting eliminated. Now that may change. That's an agency by agency issue, but just understand that seems to be the modus operandi of the DOJ people in trying to get rid of as many federal employees as possible. All right, so let's see here. Bumping. All right, bumping, how it works. So you do have a right to bump employees, but in order to do that, the person has to be in a lower tenure group or in a lower subgroup, not and, but or in a lower subgroup. And then there's 3 grades down. That's just, I don't know why they specifically have that, but it just prevents you from going down really far to be able to take over somebody else's position. Note that this is slightly different from retreating. For bumping, it's no more than 3 grades down. For retreating, if you're a disabled veteran, you can go up to 5 grades down. And I think that is to just make sure that people who don't have, as a disabled veteran who may not have another career option, that they'll be able to keep something and be able to keep some employment for what that's worth. So here are the groups again. What I've done is I've put together just how this would work. So in order for you to, as an employee, to be able to bump somebody else, you have to be able to cross one of these lines. You cannot bump somebody in your own group and subgroup. So if you're a disabled veteran, and let's say you're a 15 and you want to bump somebody who's a 14 who's also a disabled veteran, that's not going to work. You cannot just bump somebody. You can't bump somebody without crossing one of these lines that I'm showing here. So in this situation, I'm showing somebody going from disabled veteran to veteran, and then the veteran can then bump somebody who is in the all others. But for this all others, which is going to be probably the vast majority of federal employees, if you look here, the veteran has bumped down into subgroup B. So subgroup A has bumped somebody in subgroup B. Where does he go? There's nobody else left. There's nowhere to go within your tenure group. So you have to find somebody who is in the probationary group to be able, or the probationary or career conditional group, tenure group 2, to be able to bump. So that's the only way that's going to be able to work. That's why it's really difficult for permanent employees who are not veterans to be able to retain employment with the government, even if there are people in their competitive areas, if they are not going to keep their job as part of their competitive level. I didn't go over competitive levels. I've gone over that in another video. I'm talking today solely about bumping and retreating rights. So I'll just put this back here real quick. When the disabled veteran, if he wants to bump somebody else, again, it's only 3 positions down. He's got to be qualified for the job. He's going to have to go either into subgroup A, subgroup B, or tenure group 2 to be able to bump somebody. Obviously tenure group 3, but I think there aren't that many people who are in tenure group 3 if anymore. The veteran can bump down to group B or to group 2, subgroup B or tenure group 2, tenure group 1, subgroup B. Sorry, let me just take it back here for a second. This is your general federal employees with no veteran status whatsoever, but who have been with the government for a long time. They have to bump somebody in tenure group 2. They cannot just bump somebody who has less experience than them or less tenure than they do. If we're talking about bumping, it has to go from, you have to cross one of these lines. In this case, it's going to be more than one of those lines, but you have to cross at least one line to be able to bump somebody out. So you can see here, he has to go down and bump somebody in tenure group 2, assuming that such a person exists, right? And then he would do the job of that person. Again, other limitations, but this is generally how it works. So I'm going to give you some examples here. Boy, I really wish I could change where that video is being taken of me. I don't know why I even have it. So this example is a lower tenure group, okay? Mark is a GS-12 budget analyst in 1A. He's a permanent veteran with 8 years of total creditable service. Another budget analyst in the same office, Lisa, has 4 years of creditable service, but is in Group 2B. That's career conditional, non-veteran, because she recently restarted her career in the federal government with a large break. So she's been there for a while, so she has 4 years of creditable service, but she's had a break in the middle, so she's coming back as career conditional. Okay, so Mark's RIF is being eliminated. This scenario is different than a lot of what I'm seeing out there, because what's happening is that there's not being a lot of people retained in the same office. They're collapsing entire offices, or however much they can get rid of so that they can create that competitive area. But I just want to show you this so you know how it works. I'm going to go through a couple more of these, but I'm going to try to go through them quickly because I don't think it applies in a lot of situations. So here, Mark can bump Lisa because he's in a lower tenure group than she is. So he's a veteran, she's in probationary tenure group 2. He can come, he's crossing one of the lines, and he can bump her out of that job. So that's a legal bump. All right. Yeah. So Mark can bump. There's no problem with that. Same office, group 2B. So if they're in the same office, they're going to be almost certainly in the same competitive area. So competitive area is just fine. There's no competitive area problem. Let's see here. So I'm going to adjust the video here a little bit. So I'm going to go on to the second example. It's the same tenure group and subgroup. Debbie is a veteran who's a budget analyst, GS-13. She's 1A. Mike is a GS-13 budget analyst in the same work group, but in a different office, is in the same competitive area, and is a non-veteran, 1B. Debbie's job is eliminated. Okay. If Debbie she's a 13, she's a 1A, and Mike is a 1B, you're going to cross a line here. So that's going to be a legal bump. So the veteran bumps the non-veteran as long as they're in the same competitive area. That works. So that's, again, the organizational unit that is selected and the geographic commuting area. I didn't mention this before, but with competitive areas, the agency has a fair amount of discretion as to how big to make these competitive areas. So just understand that you need to take a look at your reduction in force notice. It should be listed on there what your competitive area is, and then take that. In order to analyze whether that's the right organizational unit, you really need to have an organizational chart, one of those org charts or a memorandum or something like that lays out how the organization is being done. And then you need to figure out from that basis whether the identified competitive area is the right one. I will note that I have seen multiple reduction in force notices. I'm not going to say which agency, but I'll let you guess who. And they just have screwed up literally everything in that reduction in force notice. I don't see one thing in there that is correct. I've even seen they say, we've fired everybody or we're releasing everybody in your competitive area. And even that's not true. So that's just just to let you know, you should definitely be looking at your reduction in force notice and querying everything in there, because I don't think they're being careful. I don't think they want to be. And that's why they're using this process here. All right. So example 2, Debbie can bump Mike because he's in a lower subgroup. That's exactly how this should work, at least according to the regulations. Rachel is a GS-11 program analyst with 7 years of service. She's a career employee, so she's tenure group 1 with no veteran preference, so she's subgroup B. Her position is being eliminated. In the same competitive area, again, competitive area is very important, there's a GS-9 program analyst position held by Thomas, who is also a career employee, so he's tenure group 1. So they're both tenure group 1 with no veteran preference, subgroup 2. but he only has 2 years of service. So if these people were to line up on a retention register, Rachel is definitely going to beat out Tom. But because Rachel is a GS11 and Tom is a GS9, they're most likely not going to be in the same retention register. So she can't directly compete with him. The only way that she can get his job is by bumping or retreating. All right. So this is the graph, just going back to my map here. This is where they both stand. They're both tenure group 1, subgroup B. There's no bumping rights because there's no line being crossed. So the top one is, I forgot their names, Rachel, and the bottom one is Thomas. So Rachel on top, Thomas on the bottom. Can Rachel bump Thomas? No, she can't. That's silly. But the reason why is because they are both in this subgroup B here. If you're not crossing a line, you can't do it. So it's not a legal bump. So she's not gonna be able to retain her. She's not going to be able to take his position. She might be able to take somebody else's position. But this is exactly why, as I was saying before, if you are in subgroup B in tenure group 1, it still might be very difficult to retain a position if you're not competitive with other people on your competitive level. Meaning, if all the GS11s in a certain job classification are put together, where do you end up on that? Are you going to be kept if they do 50% cuts? Are you part of the 50% that remains or not? Yeah, I guess I wrote this a couple weeks ago, so I'm just getting to it now. But again, that may not be the case for your organization. It may be they're collapsing the entire competitive area. So if that's true, this wouldn't help. Wouldn't help anyways. Yeah, so Rachel can't bump Tom because they're both in the same tenure groups and subgroups. That's the answer there. Same tenure group and subgroup here. Let's see, Terry's a GS12 budget analyst, so he's in group 1B, which is what we were just talking about, non-veteran permanent employee. He's got 5 years as an analyst and 3 years of prior IT experience. Alex is a GS11 IT specialist, group 2B, and he's in the same competitive area. So this is intentionally to create a bumping scenario where somebody's taking somebody else's job where they're not the same kind of job, right? Terry is a budget analyst now, but he previously worked in IT. Alex is an IT specialist. So these aren't at all the same competitive level. There's no way that these people would be competing against each other in the same competitive level because these jobs are not interchangeable at all. But Terry can bump Alex if the agency determines that Terry still has the capacity, adaptability, and skills needed to satisfactorily perform the duties without undue interruption. Which means, can he be trained in 90 days to be doing Alex's job? So for the purposes of this, we're just assuming that he can. Whether that's actually true would probably be subject to litigation. And so if I were Terry, I would be arguing, yeah, I can do that job. It's really easy. I did that job 3 years ago. If I were Alex, I would be arguing, no, he can't do my job because I work in, let's just say, JavaScript, and he used to do some other kind of language. He doesn't know how to do it. And it takes longer than 90 days to be able to do it. Either one of these two people would have an argument about bumping and retaining this job that Alex is presently doing. So let's just put it into the context of the map here. You can see we've got Terry's the blue and Alex is the green. So in this case, Terry goes up and he bumps out Alex because even though he's not doing that job, he has done a similar job in the past. And so bumping allows you to take a job that you didn't necessarily do, but you could do now. So that's an example of that. Again, competitive area has to be within the scope of the competitive area here. And as I said before, these agencies are trying to reduce the competitive area down as much as possible to eliminate this kind of competition and having to calculate any of these things and having to get into litigation about them. All right, so Terry can bump Alex if he's got the skills and abilities to be able to do it, as I said before. So that's the answer to this one. All right, so here's a little bit of extra information about this. So this would work. Let's just say that Terry's job was not in the government, right? Presumably IT skills are generally applicable. You can bring your private sector IT skills to the government I know the government has different IT needs, but this is exactly, if he did this in the private sector, he could still bump Alex. It just would mean that he would need to be able to tell them that he had these skills. So if you're out there and you're wondering, hey, can I keep my job or can I take somebody else's job? I don't see any reason why you wouldn't want to update your resume and give that to them, including all of the skills and abilities that you've developed out in the private sector, especially if they're recent. So this doesn't work if Terry works in a different competitive area, which we've already discussed at length here. Also, if Terry's job skills don't allow him to be able to do Alex's job satisfactorily within 90 days, that's not going to work either, right? So you have to be able to get up to speed in the job. Obviously, there are going to be some jobs that require specialized licenses. Like you wouldn't be able to go from being a nurse to being like a licensed therapist or a licensed social worker. Those are two totally different jobs unless you already have both. So that's just some of the limitations here on bumping. So retreating is, I want to say it's the same thing, but it's really not. Retreating means that you previously held a job within the federal government and it's within the same competitive area. So this is again why the competitive area is really important here. So if you previously had a job, let's say you got promoted up the ranks, you went from a 12 to a 13 to a 14 to a 15, something like that, you would be able to retreat back to that position as long as it continued to exist within your same competitive area. So if you were, let's say, a GS13 analyst and you used to be a GS12 analyst, and that person is still, or that position is still going to be retained as long as you meet one of these requirements, for not crossing the lines. You're not going to cross the lines here, but as long as you meet the requirements under the regulations and you have greater tenure rights than they do. Again, we're not crossing the lines. We're talking about the tenure, meaning take your years of service plus your computed extra years of service from your performance reviews, right? Up to 20 years. You can take that all together, and if your retention standing is higher than the retention standing of the person who is doing that job, then you can knock them out, right? So that's what retreating is, but you have to retreat to a job that you already did or that is almost exactly the same as the job that you previously did. So, for example, if they add a couple of new duties that aren't really relevant to the overall job, then at least you have an argument at that point that it's the same job. Whereas if they split up responsibilities and they've basically gotten rid of the job, then you may not be able to retreat to that. What happens is the retreating doesn't happen unless you're in the position of being released. If you're otherwise going to be released, then that's when your retreating rights kick in, just the same as bumping. But it's got to be in the same tenure group and the same subgroup. Is no more than 3 grades below you. So if you're 15, you can go down to a 12, but you can't go down to a 9. 5 for veterans with disabilities. Okay. And it's going to be in the same competitive areas. We're going to look back at this map again, and annoyingly, we're all talking about this competitive area. So if you're looking at a competitive area and it's everybody in your competitive area is being terminated, then this doesn't really help you. Okay. But if there are positions that are being kept in your competitive area, then yes. So you see here, I've added a green here for the former job. The blue is where the employee currently is. Yeah, so this is where it's okay to not cross the line, but it's only if you've done that job previously and it's not more than 3 grades below you. And also you have to have higher retention standing. So you don't have to be a veteran or disabled veteran against a non-veteran. That would be covered by bumping anyways. So that wouldn't be it. So but that's why this is an exception to the bumping. But you need to also previously perform the actual job. So in this case, the person who is getting released, he's losing his job, and he's able to bump the person in the former job. We're just assuming for the purposes of this that he has higher retention standing. The fact that he's a GS11 bumping out a GS9, that's not retention standing. Retention standing has to do with your numbers of years of service plus your computed additional years of service. So it's to my understanding, in my opinion, a really limited right. You can't cross outside between tenure group and subgroup. Again, that's bumping. If you could bump somebody, you would bump them anyways, because of course you could do a job that you previously did. It can't be in a competitive area that's not the same competitive area. So if you moved from one office to another, let's just say you moved from LA to the New York office or to the DC office, you're not going to, unless the agency defines the competitive area as being nationwide, which it can do, but I'm just telling you right now, very unlikely. That's not going to be an option for retreating. So you can't retreat outside of your competitive area. Now, what you can do if this happens to you is you can argue at the MSPB or through your union that, hey, this competitive area is drawn incorrectly. This is not the right competitive area. It should be larger than this. There certainly are good arguments out there. It just depends on the circumstances in that particular area. And so that's where I think the vast majority of the litigation is going to be going on in here. And the last piece has to be the same position or essentially an identical position. But I think that for the most part, those positions probably haven't changed that much in the last few years. So there could be a question of that. As I said before, if I were the person who was being bumped, I would want to be able to go to the MSPB, or I would go to the MSPB and argue that these positions are not essentially identical, and there's certainly case law behind that helps to define what's identical and what's not. So thank you for listening to me today. If you have issues where you're looking for assistance with how do you attack your federal reduction in force, I'm going to leave my contact information in the information below with a link that you can sign up for a time to talk with me for free. I do 10 to 15 minute phone calls for free. Been doing them throughout the week. I only have so many slots, so please understand if there's not any slots left, I'm not going to be able to talk to you until there is one that comes open. Now, you've only got, right now, everybody's on 60 days. Everybody who's received a reduction in force notice is on a 60-day or so plan. Some people have less, and that's a different issue. You might have a legal claim under there, but you need to file a complaint with the MSPB within 30 days of the effective date. And so that's just to know when you need to act on this. It's a short window, but filing a complaint with the MSPB is not particularly difficult. It takes about an hour to do. You can do it online. And so that's just so you know, you've got 30 days after the effective date of the reduction in force to get your case in front of the MSPB. But it's a pretty simple start. So if you need assistance with that, talk to a lawyer who's qualified in this area. There are plenty of lawyers who do this kind of work in front of the MSPB, especially in the DC area. Lawyers in the DC area can help people in other areas. So please reach out. You don't need to do this alone. Thank you for your attention today. I hope that some of these issues that I've raised here today are helping you to understand what your rights are with the reductions in force.